Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Web Union, and in this one there's been several advances by the Russians across the front line, from the northwestern outskirts of the Belgorod region to the southern parts of the Zaporizhzhia region. The Russians also made several advances in the Donetsk region, from the southwestern outskirts of it to the northeastern outskirts of it. The Russians also managed to advance in the direction of Chasiv Yar and to the west of Pokrovsk. Starting out in the Belgorod region, following the Ukrainian offensive into the region, the Russians have started a counterattack both in the direction of Popovka and Demidovka, where they have been trying to prevent the Ukrainians from gaining control over both of these towns. Now the Russians have managed to push the Ukrainians back to the outskirts of Demidovka, while fighting also continues over the eastern parts of Popovka, where the Russians are here attempting to push the Ukrainians back across the border area, where the Ukrainians have been unable to properly consolidate their gains across the border area, where their main positions are located in the first patches and first lines just near the border areas, and they do not have any significant presence within any urban areas within the Belgorod region. Instead, the majority of the positions, again, are in the first patches and the first lines, with just a few buildings and basements under their control. This means that the Ukrainians have been unable to gain control over any area where they can properly entrench themselves, and therefore they are likely taking large losses during the fighting within the Belgorod region without adequate cover. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to advance in the direction of Liman, where they have managed to advance towards Zarishne and Turske on the eastern bank of the Serbis River line south of Yampolivka. The Russians have here captured several fortified positions and forest lines in the northern flank of these towns and have reached the outskirts of them, gaining a foothold on the very northern outskirts of Turske. With this, the Battle of Turske has begun yet again, this time from the northern direction for the first time in many years, while the eastern road is also exposed to any Russian offensive operations through the main roads or through the forest lines. With this, the Russians have the best opportunity to capture the town of Turske in many years, with the northern flank under their control and additional offensive operations coming in from the eastern flank to be able to gain a foothold in several parts. Gaining a proper foothold and taking positions up within the basements will allow the Russians to properly establish themselves within the town and then move onwards towards Zarishne. Gaining control over both of these towns will allow the Russians to gain control over much of the Serebryansky forest area, to develop offensive operations in the direction of Liman through the forest area itself and directly towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the area. It also allowed the Russians to improve their positions in the direction of Kodidyasi along the fortified positions along the main roads to the north of Liman, and launch a wider assault from the eastern and northern flank towards Liman as well. It will also increase the security of Kreminna for Russian positions to be established within it, for major supply hubs and larger groupings of forces, as the Ukrainians would be pushed further away, limiting the strikes of artillery and FPV drones on the town. Moving on to Chasiv Yar, the Russians have advanced in the northern parts of the town. They've managed to gain control over parts of the industrial area near the apartment complex area, where the Russians are close to a full encirclement of it. The Russians are here looking to gain full control over the apartment complex area, which will allow them to fully secure the central parts of the city and move onwards towards Mykolaiivka on the western outskirts and down towards the residential areas in the southern parts, all the way down towards Stupushki in the south, Chervone and Podilsky in the west, and the fortified positions near Maiske in the north. The Russians will here look to gain full control over the city, and with control over the apartment complex area, it will only be a matter of time before the Russians gain control over the strategically important city that's been fought over for over 2 years now, the city of Chasiv Yar on the western bank of the Severodonetsk Canal. With this, we see that the Russian offensive operations continue in the northeastern and eastern parts of the Donetsk region, but it is not limited to that, as the Russians have also managed to advance to the western parts of Pokrovsk, securing the southern residential area of Kotline and moving onwards towards the railway area, where the town is split in between the railway between the northern and southern flanks. The Russians also have control of the industrial area in the northeast of Kotline. With this, the Russians are likely to continue offensive operations to regain full control over the town, move onwards towards the forest lines and the industrial area to the northwest, securing the area. The Russians have been able to gain victory after victory here near Pokrovsk over the past few weeks, as the Ukrainians attempted to launch counterattacks for 2 months now. The momentum has completely stopped, and the Russians have been able to secure several settlements that the Ukrainians had attempted to counterattack, and several settlements that had been fought over for many months. The Russians now have control over the majority of these settlements, leaving the ones that are being contested to simply Kotliny, while the Russians are at the outskirts of Novoalexandrivka and Udashne to the west, and contesting over Lysivka in the east. The Russians will likely launch further offensive operations towards Svirova in the east, gaining control over the eastern flank near the fortified positions, but the main focus will be in the direction of Udashne to the west, as well as Novoalexandrivka and Novoserhivka in the western direction towards the border area between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions. The Russians also managed to advance in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, where they advanced in the direction of Shevchenko, gaining control over the fortified positions to the southwest of Berlatsk and north of Previlne, and advancing through the forest lines and fields south of the defensive line of the Ukrainians, which is the final defensive line in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. The Russians already have control over Vesele. This contests the fortified positions in the northern parts of the Dragon Teeth line, located to the north of Shevchenko. The Russians, with the fighting over Shevchenko and Vilnopole, are attempting to gain control over the road connected from Velika Novosilka in the east through Novosilka and up towards the defensive line. The secondary road north of Velika Novosilka through Novi Kumar and towards Vesele is completely under their control, which will allow them to launch offensive operations towards Kumar in the north. And with the push from Konstantinopole in the direction of Behatir, as well as in the direction of Oleksivka, we may see a offensive by the Russian forces moving through the main roads in the southwestern outskirts, every single one of the roads, moving towards the Dnipropetrovsk region. If you look at the outskirts of the Donetsk region here in the southwestern parts, we can see that there is a river line that moves through from Elisne in the southwest towards Ivanivka in the northeast, all the way towards Vilya and Dashne in the northeast, which is connected to the Vovcha river line and the Solona river line. Based on this, we can see that the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region is actually fairly isolated from the Dnipropetrovsk region, which means it could be a safe border control for the Russians once they gain control over the settlements on the southern flank of the border area, and it can provide a natural border for defensive positions for the Russians, which means that it is less likely for the Russians to go beyond and into the Dnipropetrovsk region from the southern flank. Instead, it will be in the western direction, flanking the fortified lines of the Ukrainians in the Zaporizhzhia region from the rear, and moving through the area south of the forest lines and the river lines, which could provide a natural barrier. There's also a possibility of a push through the northern flank of the river line, moving through the main highway through the southern flank of Novopavlivka from the eastern flank of the town, as well as from the northern flank, attacking it from 3 separate directions. In the Zaporizhzhia region, there's also been an advance by the Russian forces north of Robotyne. They've gained control of an additional forest line and fortified position to the south of one of the main defensive lines that the Russian built ahead of the Ukrainian summer offensive of 2023. With this, we see that the Russians are not limiting their offensive operations to the western outskirts of the Zaporizhzhia region, but they're also working on the central part south of Orehiv, which could indicate a larger operation across the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line. It's reported that the Ukrainian forces are sending reinforcements to the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line to prevent additional advances by the Russians, taking advantage of the recent advances they have made in the Zaporizhzhia region in the western parts of it. Now, an interesting topic is something that I've talked about a lot over the past few years, and that is the artillery that has been used in this war. The Russians have always used more artillery than the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians had a long period where they struggled with artillery shells until additional aid packages closed the gap, allowing them to launch the amount of artillery that was necessary. Now we see that the Ukrainians do not really need more artillery than they have, and they have a secure amount. The reason is not because the amount of artillery shells being sent to Ukraine has increased. Instead, it is still at a low point, but it is instead that the majority of artillery has been replaced by FPV drones. According to a Russian source who is familiar not just with the number of Russian casualties, but also the reason they were injured, At the moment, more than 75% of all Russian injuries to Russian soldiers received during trench warfare are caused by UAVs, 20% are by artillery shelling, about 4% from small arms, and the final 1% are from everything else. Based on this, we can see that there is a significant change in the nature of the battles and how the Ukrainians are still managing to defend the front line despite the lack of manpower and equipment. At the same time, this is compared to how at the start of the war and in the first few years of the war, 80% of injuries on both the Ukrainian and Russian sides were caused by artillery shells. Now that we see that artillery has been almost completely replaced by FPV drones, at the same time we also see that according to the source, the time it takes to evacuate the wounded for surgical care, which is one of the highest priority of evacuations, has increased threefold from about 4.5 to 5 hours to about 14.5 hours, and this is data from Russian hospitals. In comparison, according to NATO doctrine, they go by a rule called the golden hour, and that is that the objective of an evacuation where the soldiers need of surgical care is less than 60 minutes. That is the goal, that is the optimal timing. If we see this and compare it to the fact that the Russians now need 14.5 hours, if the expectations of NATO going into war is just 1 hour compared to the reality, which could take up to 14 hours if they are equal in capabilities to the Russians, even if they are 2 to 3 times better, it is still 2 to 3 or even 4 times longer than what is expected, and this could create significant issues for NATO if they do not adapt to the current situation. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.